The Sega Saturn. This is the Sega system that some people have never even heard of, and even those who have still ignored it back in the day. When you mention Sega to the average person, they're likely to just think of Sonic and the Genesis, and that's about it. Of course, any collector nowadays knows all about the many various Sega systems and add-ons, be it the Master System, 32X, Sega CD, of course the Dreamcast, and even more obscure stuff like the SG-1000. The Sega Saturn serves kind of like a case study in how to launch a console poorly. Okay, so for starters, they released an add-on for the Genesis right before the Sega Saturn came out. Then the release for the Saturn itself was, get this, a surprise launch at E3 because they wanted to beat the original PlayStation to market. I'm sure this was probably pretty exciting for some of the die-hard Sega fans, but $400 back in 1995 isn't exactly an impulse purchase. To make matters even worse, Sony announced right after that their console would cost $100 less, in one of gaming's ultimate mic drop moments.
$299.
Money talks, and that was a huge momentum killer for Sega. Not only that, but Sega's production line was originally planned to meet demand for being released during the holiday season of that year, and not May, so there were supply issues and only certain retailers received limited stock. This pissed off retailers, but more importantly, it pissed off certain publishers and hurt support for the system. Now, obviously the Saturn had third-party games, but it could have had even stronger support had it kept healthier relationships. Something else I find very interesting that almost never gets brought up is that Sega had an opportunity to collaborate on a console with Sony. Yes, you heard me right. And I'll be sure to leave a link to the article that discusses this. Sony's failed arrangement with Nintendo is well publicized, but according to Sega of America's president at the time, Tom Kalinske, Sega had approached Sony shortly after the fallout with Nintendo. And according to Tom Kalinske, this idea was shot down by Sega of Japan. Sony wasn't the giant in the video game industry that they would eventually become at that point, and Sega was, so it's easy to see how this could have happened. I mean, does anybody remember how Nintendo's partnership with Philips turned out?
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this peace is what all true warriors strive for.
But man, it's hard to think what could have been if Sega had teamed up with Sony. A prior relationship even existed from development for the Sega CD. But enough about what could have been or should have been. Let's talk about the Sega Saturn itself as we have it here and now. Nothing too crazy as far as the standard operation of it goes. It has a lid that opens up for the game disc to go in, which I actually prefer over a sliding tray because I find them to be more reliable. Probably the most notable thing on a Sega Saturn is the cartridge slot on top. Now, if you didn't know any better, you might think this is for games, like maybe Sega Genesis games, but it's not. Don't be too disappointed though, because what it is for is actually pretty cool. You can add RAM to the console, which it utilizes to play certain games better. In fact, you can't even play certain games without it. And most, if not all of those games are 2D games, which this system excelled at. The Saturn's hardware was very capable of handling 2D, and the extra RAM made it even better. It's one of the biggest things that retro gamers love about it nowadays. You see, at a time when the industry was shifting its focus to 3D, Sega put out a system that could run some pretty awesome 2D games. The two biggest types of games that stand out when it comes to this are shooters and fighters. All of Capcom's big 2D hits from the arcade came to the Saturn, and the ports were almost guaranteed to perform better than their PlayStation 1 counterparts. The Saturn also had a large number of awesome 2D shooters available, with one of its most famous being Radiant Silvergun. And what better way to play all these awesome 2D games than with the Saturn's excellent controller, which still has the best D-pad ever made if you ask me, and many others. Now, you've probably noticed that a lot of these games aren't in the North American cases, and that's because they're Japanese games. That's because the Saturn is one of the best systems to import games for. The most common way to play these import games is with one of these action replay carts that just plug right in, and are highly recommended because they also come with that RAM expansion I talked about earlier, as well as storage to write your game saves too. The Saturn actually had some success in Japan, and as a result has way more games that came out in that market. There's a lot of reasons you could point to for why this is, but a big reason people love to point out is the marketing they had over there. The commercials over there had this dude named Sega Saturn who would beat the hell out of kids for doing more socially acceptable stuff like playing baseball when they should be playing Sega Saturn. For obvious reasons, people love this guy. Some of the other reasons people love the Saturn is for its library of fun arcade ports, as well as some of the truly unique games that you'd only find on a Sega machine. It's a shame that not many people played the Saturn back in the day, and an even bigger shame now as it remains fairly inaccessible due to high prices of many of the games. If the console had sold better while it was new, then there'd be more copies available in the secondhand market now, and prices probably wouldn't be as high. But the situation is what it is, and I'd still encourage people to look into this system. The console itself is priced reasonably, and you can still get a handful of some of the more common games for cheaper. I'm curious though, how many of you watching own a Saturn, and what do you think of it? So let me know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.